Hello, fellow bike people. Do you know the difference between illegal and unlawful? One's a sick bird. But seriously, one thing that really sticks out to me about bikes is the fact that the legal structures surrounding riding, they often clash with bike culture in general. Now, the most obvious example of that is, of course, the idea of bikes on bike lanes versus bikes on the road versus bikes on sidewalks, and that is such a complicated topic, I'm not even going to approach it today. What I want to talk about is these things, BMX bikes. These are my favorite kind of bike. If you watch any of my videos, you probably figured that out. And that is because they are a ton of fun, they're fairly affordable to get something high-end, and they're pretty much bomb-proof. They're really low maintenance, and I like that about them. Now, BMX bikes and the culture surrounding them differ from the legal system in a lot of ways. Right off the bat, you're going to notice this thing has no bell, it has no reflectors, it has no lights, but most of all, it has no brakes. That is not a coaster brake. Now, this is my personal bike, and most of the time I use a brake on it because most of the tricks I can do actually depend on having a brake. So the more reasonable among you might be wondering, why would you do that to your bike and why would you make it illegal? And yeah, I gotta say, this is illegal to ride on the road in most places. I gotta give you a bit of a history lesson. So if you go on a website called bicycleretailer.com, it's actually Bicycle Retailer and Industry News, or BRAIN, you'll see a series of articles by a guy called Rick Vosper, and they're talking about the generations the bike industry's had. He effectively refers to the generations that the industry's gone through since World War II as Bike 1.0 through Bike 4.0. Now with BMX, you can actually apply a somewhat similar structure. In this case, it's going to be old school, mid school, and new school. This is a perfect example of an old school bike. In terms of classic old school design cues, you can see the really big dropouts, you can see the skinny tubes, you can see the threaded headset, the motorcycle-inspired handlebars, the very skinny, hard plastic seat, fairly skinny tires, and a coaster brake. So it pedals backwards to stop instead of having handbrakes. Now this is not a true 80s BMX. Pacer Silver Streak, this is, I believe, a Sears bike, so it is a department store model, and this one may even be from the 90s, just designed to look like an older bike. But it gets the point across. This is what the first generation of BMX bikes looked like. They were extremely lightweight, and they were designed for racing because they were based off motocross bikes. Now, in the early 80s, they went through a bit of a transition where they started going to skate parks and copying what the skaters were doing on these bikes, and that spawned freestyle. So to turn this 80s style race bike into an 80s style freestyle bike, you would add handbrakes, the gyro detangler, thread-on or bolt-on, clamp-on style pegs, whatever you want to call them, standers, I usually see them called, and quite probably replace the coaster brake with a freewheel so it can backpedal. So in that state, this bike would have been very lightweight, very easy to use for what would be considered parking lot tricks today. So things like wheelies, endos, and standing on different parts of the frame. The downside is these were incredibly fragile. You go off a curb too hard and you're snapping your frame on an 80s style bike. So that's when we get to the mid-school generation. So in about the, let's say, mid-90s up to 2008, give or take a couple years, we had the mid-school generation of BMX. The first design cue that really sticks out to me is the fact that it is much more compact in design. The handlebars are smaller, everything's a lot more stubby in terms of frame design. And it's also got much thicker tubes. Like the frame itself, the metal tubes used to construct that are much thicker, much more heavier duty. Because with this generation of bikes, there was a general mentality of heavier equals stronger. It was effectively an overreaction to the really fragile bikes from the old school generation. This bike weighs a ton. And yeah, it's tough, it can take a beating, but it's not going to allow easy progression when it comes to learning tricks like an 80s bike or a more modern bike. If you look up videos of pro BMX riders from the early 2000s, it does look like they're really having to work the bikes to actually do any kind of tricks, and that's just a result of this design. Just before the early 2010s, BMX bikes started evolving into the new school generation, where they were effectively a Goldilocks balance between the rideability of the old school bikes and the durability of the mid-school bikes, with the added benefit of modern geometry is really ergonomic. It feels good to ride, and it encourages you to push the bike because you feel more connected to it. It feels like the bike responds much better to your inputs than an older bike. Like when I said the 80s bikes are really good to use for tricks, I specified parking lot tricks because if you're trying to go big and do huge spins or combinations, they are more difficult. They just don't have the correct geometry to be able to handle that. Now this is my personal bike, and it's a good bike, but it's not the absolute top of the line. You can get way better BMX bikes than this. But something like this is so smooth and flowy and durable, and you don't have to worry about it giving up under you, that you can really experiment with new things. And that's where the brakeless comes in. Long walk for a short drink of water, I know. One of the core aspects about BMX that really differentiates it from mountain and road is it requires very much less endurance capacity compared to the other styles of cycling, with a much greater focus on handling skill. So with a BMX, you're going to be using everything available on the bike to manipulate how it handles. You're talking steering, you're talking braking, and most importantly, bike body separation, where your bike can be pointing one way, your body can be pointing another, and you can balance out the two to get the outcome you want, the direction you want. With a brake, you can obviously modulate your speed. You can wash off some of that energy that's in the bike just with a squeeze of your finger. Without a brake, you can't do that, so you have to adapt your riding style to be a little bit more like a skateboarder, where you're using turning to wash off your momentum, and most of the time you're trying to just carry that momentum and control it over whatever obstacle you're approaching instead of washing it off beforehand to make it easier. It's, in my mind, the BMX equivalent of an FPS gamer playing on extra hard difficulty with a ridiculously sensitive aim sensitivity. So while this setup would make just riding around harder for an average person, somebody who's at that level would actually prefer the challenge. Now that's not to brag myself, I don't think I'm personally at that level to really push the bike enough to need to go brakeless, but I'm going to play around with it for a little while and hopefully report back to you in another video. Now to wrap up the video, circling back to the beginning, the legality of this. Because, let's be honest, this is definitely not road legal almost anywhere. I'm sure there is somewhere in the world where you can ride a bike with no brakes and there's no laws concerning it. But in Canada, at least, you need to have a brake on your bike to ride on anywhere that's controlled by the Highway Traffic Act. That means this bike is perfectly legal to ride on your own private property or on other private property that does not require a brake on it. So if you were to put this bike in your car, drive it to the skate park or the dirt jumps, ride it there, put it back in your car and drive home, you haven't broken any rules. If you were to use this as your daily rider, yeah, you're technically breaking rules, but realistically, unless you're causing problems, I've really never experienced an issue with that being enforced. Where it becomes an issue is if, let's say you're riding street, you annoy a security guard a bit too much, they call the cops, that cop happens to be really angry, and they decide to hit you for everything that they can, they're going to give you a ticket for that. They're going to give you a ticket for no bell. They're going to give you a ticket for no reflectors or lights, depending on what you need in your area. But that really is a case of, if you're annoying people too much, there may be some repercussions. That's not, in my opinion, a direct reflection of the bike not having brakes. So, my final conclusion on all this, obviously brakes are extremely important and you need one for riding around. But for sporting reasons, this is a perfectly valid way to set up a bike, and it's a fun challenge.